to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Centre for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Centre Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Welcome to the Humphrey School, to today's conversation on legal plunder, the predatory dimensions of criminal justice. We have a full room, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that will follow. This timely book, authored by Professors Joshua Page and Joe Soss, offers a searing analysis of how our systems of law and justice have not only enforced order, but have also extracted resources from the very communities most in need of support. Their work challenges us to confront questions at the heart of equity, democracy, and public trust. At the Humphrey School, we are deeply committed to addressing these very issues. Our faculty, students, and partners work daily at the intersections of human rights, constructive dialogue, and economic justice, all themes that are present in the volume that we will be discussing today. We strive to prepare leaders who will not only understand the structures of inequality, but also act with courage and creativity to dismantle them. Today's event is a model of that commitment, bringing scholarship, public service, and community together to wrestle with hard truths and imagine better possibilities. We are so honored to have with us today Joe Soss. Joe is the inaugural Coles Chair for the Study of Public Service here at the University of Minnesota, with faculty appointments in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, Political Science, and Sociology. Professor Joshua Page is the Fink Professor of Sociology and Law at the University of Minnesota. We also have our very good friend Keith Ellison, and our 30th Attorney General since January of 2019. A.G. Ellison is also a professor here at the Humphrey School. So if you'd like to find a class, that's a great one to enroll in. And then also on our panel is Karen Ho. Karen Ho, Professor Ho, is faculty in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and former director of RIGS, that's Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Initiative. And then finally online, you have here on the screen, Ilya Somin is Professor of Law at George Mason University and the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Thank you so much for being here with us. You're joining us in the Josie Johnson Room, a space that is named for one of Minnesota's great champions of justice and civic engagement. I cannot think of a better place for today's conversation. With that, please join me in welcoming our panelists and begin what will be a thoughtful and very lively conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dean Botchway. My name again is Karen Ho. I'm a professor in the Anthropology Department here at the University of Minnesota, and I'll be moderating today's event brought to you by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to participate in today's conversation and submit your questions during the event. Those of you online can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And for our in-person audience, we will be coming around to collect question cards, getting as many questions as we can. We also have closed caption available. For those of you who would like a live transcript of today's program, you can enable that by clicking on the closed caption button on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Our guests for today's program, Legal Plunder, Making Money Off Policing and Punishment, are Attorney General Keith Ellison, Professor Ilya Somin, and the co-authors of the new book, Legal Plunder, The New Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice, Professors Joshua Page and Joe Soss. Attorney General Ellison, Professor Somin, Page, and Soss, thank you for joining us. And thank you. So I'm going to start with a few remarks of my own, and then we'll move into discussion and then Q&A. Legal plunder is a remarkable intervention. It's a critical, expansive, multi- and interdisciplinary diagnosis of the cultural practices, ideologies, devastating impacts, and conditions of possibility of widespread financial extraction against vulnerable individuals and communities justified under the auspices of criminal justice. We live in a society and political economy where the authority of the state is invoked, the operational capacities of public and private partnerships and institutions, from courts to prisons, corporations to jails, are mobilized so that on a daily basis, the financial resources of millions of people, especially those who are not protected by wealth and whiteness, are extracted using the threat, possibility, and the enacting of conviction, apprehension, and/or incarceration. The authors state, quote, "There is no equivalent in US history for the scale and intensity of financial takings today, their pervasiveness and diversity across criminal legal institutions, or their reach into the most policed and punished communities," end quote. They ask us to ruminate what it means to have revenue-centered policing and incarceration, what it means to cross-fertilize policing power and taxing power, what it means to, quote, "have the court as a site of adjudication and financial extraction," what it means to profit off a captive audience, what it means to actively create the very conditions of disempowerment and desperation that then allow these institutions to leverage these vulnerabilities for fees, payments, and plunder. Gray areas are taken advantage of. The space in between civic and criminal, the suspicion of or proximity to entanglements and criminal legal entanglements are utilized to exact fees from friends and family, to justify asset forfeitures of cars, homes, cash. On a per capita basis, quote, "Chicago produces more revenues through fines, fees, and forfeitures than any US city besides DC. Their auto-related forfeitures was $264 million in 2016. Importantly, Page and Soss recognize that there's a whole arsenal of discourses and abstract lip service, not to mention myths, that allow these effronteries to be normalized. Public safety and security, law and order, institutions of extraction are just, quote, "places of business. These fees are, quote, "ordinary market transactions. The blame is laid at the door of self-management and responsibility where, quote, "failed deviants need to pay the price for choices they have freely made," end quote. Rather, Page and Soss show the counter evidence through life-altering, devastating stories. They remind us that officers stopped Philando Castile 49 times, issuing 82 citations for minor infractions that cost him more than $7,000. These stops were based oftentimes on suspicions of entanglement, suspicions that were made possible by alternative facts, profiling, and the fantasy of racist assumptions. They remind us that getting into the crosshairs of criminal legal governance is often about who is targeted, the active targeting of race and class subordinated communities, not Wall Street or Beverly Hills, where we know that illegal and illicit practices are ubiquitous. I want to point out 4 key takeaways, especially for me. 1, we are in a key historical moment where financialization, the active transformations of all kinds of values into financial assets, into profits, is not only happening to houses, corporations, and student loans, but directly and explicitly onto people, especially the most vulnerable. Page and Soss demonstrate that, quote, "a core feature of criminal legal governments today is to take advantage of the individuals under control, their holdings, and turn them into revenue-generating assets. Governments have been full participants in this, and in some cases, the creators of these extractive operations, from selling corporations monopoly access to handing people on probation over to for-profit supervision," end quote. In fact, visions of good governance call on, quote, "resource-deprived managers to think like entrepreneurs and look for ways to monetize their operations." Terrifyingly, institutions first had to create the conditions for leverage. For example, if you restrict library access or the banning of books by mail, then that pressures or channels incarcerated people to purchasing and being indebted to a tablet. Having soap that disintegrates after one use, having deodorant that burns, allowing 38 states to have no legal obligations to provide menstrual products, reducing the amount of food, requiring video visits, creating the conditions where private corporations and public-private partnerships monopolize and charge exorbitantly for basic necessities. And on top of this, there's fees for beds, for money deposits, i.e. incarcerated peoples and their families are billed for their own incarceration. Think about the power involved in this kind of assetization, which is a quintessential example of racial capitalism. The construction of a race and class hierarchy, the strengthening of the mechanisms and infrastructures for control, the creation of constraints, and the assumption of no other options become the conditions of possibility of windfall profits through this capture. And it's all framed as inclusion, right? Including the vulnerable into the marketplace, what Keeanga-Yamada Taylor frames as predatory inclusion. They remind us that the neoliberal penal state operations cannot simply be understood as exclusion or segregation or warehousing and quarantining. In fact, Page and Soss argued that the focus should be on production, how folks are made productive, how institutions include in order to exploit and extract. Quote, the practices that governing authorities use to exclude and deprive have enabled and facilitated the incorporation of legally entangled people into extractive relations. Power is productive. This kind of financialization also means that people are not being invested in. Now, investment is post-World War II GI Bill, right? We're mainly white men. College, job placements, low rate, stable 30-year mortgages were guaranteed. Debt is when these investments get outsourced to individuals themselves through loans, which characterized much of the 1970s and beyond. But now what we have is financialized extraction, creating a world of expropriation where downward mobility is a given. Another key point I want to emphasize is that Page and Soss demonstrate that this development was not necessarily a top-down master orchestration. It was historically contingent and specific. Quote, the entrepreneurs who created carceral banking, for example, had no hand in the proliferation of court fees. The US Congress was central to the rise of asset forfeiture, but had little to do with the growth of for-profit probation programs, end quote. So one of the key points that they point out is that the development was, quote, intense fiscal constraints created by anti-tax policies and policy devolution to lower levels of government and the large-scale entry of private businesses that saw profitable opportunities in the field, end quote. In a sense, a key example is how mass incarceration boomeranged onto itself. The anti-democratic, racist rise of mass incarceration intersected with neoliberal anti-tax policies to create an implosion, i.e. you have an increase in operations with a decrease in funding. Created the conditions so that, quote, entrepreneurial approaches to management searched for new ways to exploit their assets. To solve fiscal crises, they need to innovate through innovation, through financialization. By, quote, integrating criminal legal operations to finance, end quote, financial charges could now be imposed onto vast numbers of people at multiple points of contact. And this model has spread, right? Imagine entire law enforcement budgets dependent on revenue policing. Another key insight from Page and Josh is that this phenomena across the criminal legal system completely annihilate the distinction, separation, or categorization of public and private. If we used to assume that different values, incentives, and protections govern one space versus another, they had disabused ourselves of this notion. Quote, publicly and privately run prisons operate according to a shared market logic that conceives of prisons as firms, people under custody as consumers, and administrators as business persons. State and market managers alike work to make the populations they control productive, leveraging them to lower costs, maximizing returns on investments, and achieve their revenue goals, end quote. In other words, America's public institutions of criminal legal governance, right, are being marketized. The Department of Justice can no longer claim that it's only profit business or only profit prisons are the problem, right? They can't frame that the problem is corporate involvement and that the solution is a restoration of government control. In fact, quote, rather than shrinking the state as small government rhetoric promised, institutional policy changes turn state capacities more aggressively toward market creating and market supporting purposes, right? So custodial and supervisory forms of predation are most commonly organized as public-private partnerships. They're braided and made possible through each other. So, so for those of you who don't know, I actually study Wall Street investment banks and financiers. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And I want to make sort of one thing that this book really showcased for me was a stark difference, right, between how Wall Street was treated. Full scale. Now, and a lot of members of actually Congress didn't know this, right, because what the Fed and what the US Treasury did was in large part hidden. We had a full scale bailout, not only through TARP, right? But it amount to what Larry Jacob and Desmond King point to as $7.7 trillion of subsidy, loan guarantees, full-scale buy-up of toxic assets for Wall Street banks and financiers and insurance companies. No strings attached. Compare no strings attached to the highly surveilled financialization, right, onto these communities. By the way, those who experienced foreclosure, right, compared to 7.7 trillion, only had about 40 billion dispersed. Out of that, approximately 2 billion was actually dispersed, right? 7.7 trillion, 2 billion with lots of strings attached. So think about the sort of fictions of the free market on the one hand that subsidy produced, and then the active use of financialization to engender and mobilize further financialization. Okay, I'm gonna now move to the panelists. And my first question is for Attorney General Ellison, and my second question is for Professor Somin. Attorney General, throughout the book, Page and Soss show how predatory practices have taken root across our institutions of policing, adjudication, and punishment. They argue that we cannot really understand how such institutions operate today without paying close attention to these practices. As Attorney General, how do you think about these practices in the broader context of criminal legal governance in Minnesota and the many challenges that surround it?
So if there's one thing that really is a government function, it must be criminal justice. I am not one who believes that nobody can do anything to lose their freedom because of what they did. I think people do things that justify having them held away from the rest of us. I think that there are people who, look, rapes happen, murders happen, robberies happen, fraud happens. These things happen. They don't always happen, but they do happen. And so criminal justice is necessary, but when you introduce the profit motive to it, you destroy it. Any sort of legitimacy that goes along with it. If you found yourself behind a prison cell, you should have fair bail hearing, fair representation in court. You should be, your sentencing should have a robust advocacy for you and on all sides. But if anybody is making money off of it, it just introduces the most pernicious incentives, and we've seen those. Anybody remember seeing that documentary Cash for Kids about the New Jersey judge who had a financial interest in sending kids to the juvenile justice facility that he helped make sure happened? But that's just like the smallest example of how this goes really, 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 really wrong. And so I think for those of you who are gonna be involved in actually administering real justice on the ground for people as best you can, particularly if you're gonna be in a policymaking role, you really should read this book carefully because it can help you actually move toward the goal that you're seeking, which is a criminal justice system, not just a profit-sucking machine off of vulnerable people. I mean, questions I wrote down as I read this book. Does any of this financialization of the criminal justice system make anyone safer? Is it reducing mass shootings? Is it politically desirable? Is it working? Is it working from the standpoint of safety and fair outcomes? I think the answers are clearly no. Clearly no. They're not. And there's another thing that I'll say that really the book doesn't go into, but I think really sort of like the book like provokes the question. To what degree is our corporate structure implicated in crime? If I make my car in a way that teenagers can steal it easily with a UBS cord, and I know it, and I still do it because it saves me money, and I can say it's not my fault. Am I involved when some 14-year-olds steal the Kia and it gets and drives 90 miles down the street and kills a Hmong elder, as did in fact happen? It's legal to make guns in America, but what if I make them in a way where I know good and well that this gun will be put together with a $10 switch, which will convert my handgun into a machine gun, and I know it, been knowing it. I don't care. In fact, I market machine guns, which are illegal to the general public, because I know you can get a switch to convert it into one. I mean, and then opioids. What if I say, hey, this stuff here, it'll kill your pain and it won't addict you, but I know damn well it will. There are a number of things that we've got to ask ourselves. Not only are we financializing, I don't know what the word is for turning our criminal justice system into just another big money pit as opposed to a criminal justice system, but on the other hand, are there things that a responsible corporate community could or should do to prevent crime in the first place? And that we never even ask them. We will throw that 21-year-old teenager in prison for murder, and arguably that's an outcome that we all is fair, just, and I know we'll all debate that point. But why is that person the only person who's going to pay for what happened at the truck stop nightclub in 2022 when Markeisha Wiley met her death, when we found guns on the scene that were bought by a straw purchaser from a company that I expect to prove knew very well was purchasing those guns for trafficking? Y'all following me? So I guess what I love this book. If you are going to be a politician or work in the criminal justice system, read this book and be very, very suspicious when somebody says, I got a neat idea. What if we got, some business guy to somehow be able to make money and help us do our job, which is to monitor people on probation or whatever? You're gonna have problems because you'll get more of it if somebody's getting paid for it. On the other side, let's ask more of our corporate community to make safer streets and communities. And I'll leave it right there.
Thank you so much. Professor Somin, you are one of the nation's leading scholars of government powers and the many ways they have been used and abused in the past and today, including the asset seizure practices that Page and Soss write about. Given your expertise, are there any aspects of the book you want to highlight as especially important interventions or as offering guidance for legal and political action going forward? Alternatively, are there any arguments in legal plunder that you might take issue with or encourage us to think about in a different way?
Thank you to the University of Minnesota for hosting this event, to the authors for their insightful book, and to the Attorney General for his thoughtful comments. I have a number of important points of agreement with this book, which is a valuable intervention. I also have some disagreements, so I'll start with the agreements first and then proceed to possible points of contention. I think the bottom line is I agree with the authors on a lot of the policies they cover, and in many cases also on what should be done about them, but I have more problems with their analytical framework and some of its implications. So first, I certainly agree we have too many people in prison, often under indefensible, unjustifiable conditions. I also agree that the government and private actors involved in the criminal justice system often have very bad incentives. To take just one example, when there's an asset forfeiture system, the police often have incentives to concentrate in situations where they can seize assets like cars, an example described in the book, which then can in fact provide revenue for the police department, but not focus on actual things like rape, murder, assault, and so forth, where those are much greater threat to the general public. But if you catch a rapist or a murderer, there usually is not an asset that you can seize that can go into the police revenue. And so I saw this, firsthand when I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, then one of the highest crime cities in the United States, small cities that is. The police were incredibly aggressive about issuing parking tickets. If you overstayed your parking space by 5 minutes, they would be right there. If murder and rape was going on, that seemed like it was not as high a priority because they couldn't, in most cases, they couldn't get any resources out of it. And there are similar problems in other areas of the criminal justice system that the authors also describe. There is also a major problem described in the book of the imposition of various fines and fees and the like with little or no due process. Asset forfeiture is an example. So is the system of various kinds of payments and extractions in pretrial detention, also described at length in the book. The entire system of pretrial detention is actually problematic from a due process and a moral point of view because it's dealing with people who have not yet been convicted of a crime and may not even be charged or have any real opportunity to defend themselves for weeks or months, and that is severely problematic, and it's obviously even more problematic given that most of the people involved are poor and don't have ready opportunities to get lawyers or other assistance to help them with the process. Some of the authors' analysis of public and private intertwinement in the system also is compelling. I think in many quarters, particularly on the political left, there's a tendency to think where when for-profit actors are involved, that's a problem. But if government employees are doing it, that's fine. The authors show, they equivocate on this a little bit, but the authors show that in many cases this just isn't true. And if we're worried, as the Attorney General is, about people making money out of the system, it's not only private investors or private employees who do it. Government employees do so too. Indeed, it's to some extent unavoidable in that police, prosecutors, other government officials, other government employees, including me, yes, I too am a government employee. I work at a state university. We generally don't work for free. We love our jobs maybe, but we also love the money that comes into our bank accounts. Most of us love it at least. And therefore, that creates incentives for us that may be problematic. So the goal here should not be to ensure that no one makes money or no one makes a profit. Rather, the goal should be that the people who make money should have the right structure of incentives and not that they should be incentivized, to catch the murderers, rapists, and so forth, but also to allow due process and the like. Now for some disagreements. One is, I think the analytical framework here has some problems in that what counts as predation, at least as far as I can tell, is not always, carefully defined, and sometimes seems influenced by problematic concepts drawn from sources like Marxist exploitation theory, which has very serious analytical problems, which the authors, I think, don't fully confront. For example, that theory is based on the long discredited Weber theory of value, the idea that the value of products or services depends on the value of the labor put into them rather than on the demand for the good or service. This a problem economists pointed out already in the 19th century, but it persists. I think the use of the framework of neoliberalism also has problems. over the years, it seems to me that neoliberalism has turned into sort of a catch-all, negative phrase used both by some people on the left and also some people on the nationalist conservative right to sort of denote anything that they don't approve of. So markets can be neoliberal, but increasing government involvement can also be neoliberal. And if neoliberal is just a term that we use for almost anything we consider bad, then its analytical usefulness is extremely limited at best. There's also occasional passages that I think reflect problematic assumptions, such as, for instance, claims that the 70s and 80s saw declining welfare state investments. That is actually not true. Per capita welfare state spending since the 1970s has actually greatly increased. The overall reach of government overall in many areas has increased and the like. You can argue it should have increased more. That's a perfectly legitimate argument, but it's not the same thing as saying it's gone down. You also occasionally see passages like the one saying where all workers under capitalism face coercion because otherwise they might not have the food and resources they need to survive. At some level, this is true, but of course, it's also true under any economic system because somebody has to work in order to produce the goods that we need to survive. And those of us who have lived under socialism, like me, know that these pressures are actually worse under socialism, and you get much more in the way of starvation and other lack of basic necessities. There is also a deep issue that I think the book at times approaches, but doesn't really confront, and that is, as the Attorney General suggested, there are people, arguably at least, who deserve to be incarcerated: murderers, rapists, robbers, and so forth, and punished in various ways. If people deserve to be in that situation, some of them, then arguably it may also be justifiable if they bear some of the costs of that process. Maybe it's justifiable if they work in prison or if they have to pay some fines or fees and the like. If, on the other hand, they don't deserve to be in the situation, I think actually there are many millions of people who get caught up in this system who don't deserve to be in it, then whether the government or private parties manage to extract resources in the process is almost morally irrelevant, because even if nobody profits in any way whatsoever, it's still unjust to imprison them. And I think this important distinction is one that's significant, and in some ways I'm actually more radical than the authors might be on some of these issues. I think the entire war on drugs is unjust and should be abolished. Anyone incarcerated there, regardless of whether there's profit being made or not, anyone incarcerated for that, it's an injustice. I think virtually all immigration restrictions should be abolished. The author described the awful system of immigration detention. The proper solution to that is not to worry about people or whether people are making money from it, but about the fact that it exists in the first place. But I do think there's an important distinction here between people who deserve to be incarcerated or under probation or under conditions and those who do not. And it may be that the moral principles and policy solutions that apply to these two types of cases are going to be different. Finally, depending on what we consider to be predation, it's possible that a wide range of activities that the authors and others might approve of, but nonetheless fall under predation. If the idea is predation occurs anytime the government or private parties forcibly extract resources from people who are not elite or privileged in some sense, then a wide range of ordinary tax and regulatory policies might also be seen as predation. And at some level, I, a libertarian, sympathize with that view, but I'm not sure the authors would want to go there. And if they don't, then that further suggests that sort of the definition of predation might need more refinement. So thank you so much for the opportunity to comment, and I congratulate the authors on an important book, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Somin. Now we'll actually, Somin, thank you. Now we'll turn it to Professor Soss and Professor Page, who have about 5 minutes each to contemplate, think through, and some of these comments, and take us into other directions.
Thank you. for all the comments, everyone. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to be brief because I want us to have plenty of time for audience questions as well here. I'll just take a moment to respond to some of the critiques by Professor Somin because I think they're worthwhile and important to attend to. First of all, I just want to say that I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between some of the comments that Professor Somin made and what we actually argue in the book. For example, we don't argue that neoliberalism explains what is happening here. In some sense, in fact, we don't really use this as a label for what's happening in some ways. What we say is that many of the trends, many of the developments in policy and politics and governance that we see in this domain have been studied in some ways most aggressively, most intensively by people who do work on neoliberalism. And so the concepts that we're actually using in the book for the most part are things like privatization. They're things like financialization. Like securitization. These are very specific processes, and whether or not you choose to put them all together under an umbrella concept of neoliberalism is in some ways less important than the way in which we see them operating here. It's true that there's a very important history and origins of the concept of exploitation in Marxian theory, and we can have a discussion about labor theory of value, but we don't actually rest our analysis on that Marxian conception of exploitation precisely because our book is about the shift from labor exploitation to financial exploitation. And so we're not actually dealing with questions of labor necessarily in its relation to value, and we're not using a definition of exploitation that is grounded specifically in Marxian thinking. We're drawing on much more broad sociological work on the way in which relationships can be exploitative. Right? Whether those relationships are credit relationships or the relationship between two partners in a romantic relationship or lending, or there could be all sorts of forms. So it's not really about that per se. I'll take a little issue with the idea that we assume that there have been declining welfare investments in the 70s and 80s as well, because my last book was an entire book about how welfare investments did not decline in the 70s and 80s. They were actually put to new purposes in disciplining the poor rather than withdrawing support from the poor. So we changed what we do with welfare, and we did, in fact, disinvest from certain types of welfare, social services and social welfare investments, and raise our investments in others. That's not an overall decline, but it's a great shift in what happened. And then I'll just simply add that I'm very happy to hear that Professor Somin is for the abolition of the war on drugs. I'm not sure where he picked up that we might not be, but we would join him in that call. And so I thank him for that strong suggestion. I'll hand it over to Josh.
Yeah. Thank you all very much. It's really an honor to have this event. It's really, I'm really grateful for you all being here, Professor Somin, Attorney General Ellison, Professor Ho. It's really great. This is our first, well, we've had a couple of events like at bookstores and so forth, but it's been more sort of just small exchanges. This is the first time we've had people actually spend a good chunk of time to actually talk about the book, engage it, and it's really weird for the first time to hear people talking about the book you've been working on forever, and to hear like what people are taking away is really cool, and I'm very eager to hear the questions. So I'm not actually going to say much, but I'll come back to something Attorney General Ellison said, which was the focus on corporatization. And here I think, the concept of neoliberalism is useful because what we're talking about is not just the infusion of corporate interest into criminal justice, but the way that public entities, public agencies take on a corporate mentality and what folks call this sort of marketization, where as the privates are profiteering, it's really these state actors that are under these amazing fiscal restraints that are being sort of forced into this sort of entrepreneurial logic and continually trying to come up with creative measures to figure out how to fund policing, and other services. And so part of what we talk about is this sort of story about public finance, how, resources declining at the local level and investments from the federal government, the state government, really make these local governments, they create these rolling sets of financial crisis. And it's not that these people are like devious actors conspiring. How do we take advantage of folks? They're trying to deal with real problems. And as they're doing that, they more and more come to think entrepreneurially. So the one things that they can control often are things like fines and fees and asset forfeitures. They have little control over their budgets and so forth. So I think one of the points we want to make is this is not just about privatization. This is not just about corporations coming into the field. It is about that, but it's also about how public sector actors come to think and act a lot like those in the corporate sector, right? So when they are making contracts with telecommunications companies, not just saying like, what are the rates going to be, but how much money will we get in the commissions, in the kickbacks, right? Because those are super important, because those are the states trying to deal with their own funding problems. So I just wanted to highlight that point. And again, just really thank you all. The critiques are so welcome also. It's really great to hear, again, one of the reasons we wanted to have people from different perspectives on this panel is just to hear how people are coming at the book in different ways and read and getting different things out of it. So again, I'll just say thank you.
Karen, can I make a quick comment?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I sure appreciate you saying what you're saying. When a prison says we're going to charge inmates for phone calls to family members, which is a very important thing in terms of reducing recidivism, reintegrating people into community. I mean, the prison has to deal with the fact that we've had a bunch of tax cuts to people who didn't ask for them and didn't need them. Some people asked for them. And now the prison has to get by on a reduced budget. I mean, and they got to come up with some bright ideas. And I'm glad that we didn't just go to the simple explanation. We really do just have to raise enough taxes to have a criminal justice system where at least if we get it wrong, at least we're doing it for the public interest and in the public interest, and not because it keeps somebody, it helps somebody's profit margin. Now, to Professor Somin, let me just be clear. I do agree with you that government can have perverse incentives as well. It's not just, the corporate community. I'm thinking of like Ferguson, the city of Ferguson. Anybody remember when Mike Brown, and there was such a horrendous situation. One of the things that the DOJ report found is that the city of Ferguson was essentially paying for all of the city services based on targeted fines, mostly toward African-American motorists. And that's part of this conversation too. It is true that yes, I don't think there should be private prisons. I just simply don't think they should exist. I also think that we have to raise enough money so that the Fergusons of this world don't have to essentially predate financially on their citizens to just meet their basic city services. So I'll just stop there.
That sounds great. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm just going to start with a key one that actually cuts across many of the questions. And one is, and this is for mainly Professor Soss and Page, but also to actually, I'll leave you, sorry. Okay. Do you see a connection between those who champion this monetization of the justice system and those within our government who are actively working to delegitimize democracy?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Some of them are the same people, so there's a connection there. I think that what we argue in the book is that what is happening here is deeply, runs strongly against the values not only of justice, but also of democracy. One of the questions that we try to return people's attention to time and again is, what does it mean to be treated as a sort of available target of predatory extractive practices by your own government, and no less under the banner of law and justice, right? What message does that send to communities? What happens when being in public community spaces in your neighborhood becomes, right, an encounter with risk of having more and more taken from you? What happens when the most, in a sense, the people whose resources are taken most intensively tend to be the elder women in poor communities of color, the moms and the aunties and the others who, when you look at what's happening here, what does that do to your sense of belonging, of citizenship, right? And so this is in many ways what we're charting here is a project that at the very least places no value on the full membership of people in those communities, on their citizenship and on their democratic incorporation. And in many ways, while this is a set of practices that occurs at the sort of blurred boundary between market actors, corporations, and governments, right, public and private, it is something that is very much about sort of the extraction of revenues and the policing and punishment of communities coming together in a way that displaces democracy.
And I would just add at a lower level of analysis, in one of the chapters, it's about what these practices do. And partly that's about inequality, that's about sort of reshaping citizenship, but it's also about accountability, right? Is that particularly when, the private actors, the private companies that are involved in this have, different reporting requirements, for example, than the government. So private prisons don't have to have the same reporting requirements as public prisons. There's 3 chapters in this book that are based on my ethnographic research as a bail bond agent. One of the reasons I did that research is because there is so little information about how bail bond companies work, because they don't have to report that. They don't have to report who they bail out, how they bail out, or any of these kind of things, right? But again, it's not just the private companies. When governments start to rely on civil asset forfeiture, right? These become in effect sort of slush funds, right? They become a way for folks for these things to have money, this discretionary pot of money that they can use, and there's very little transparency around it and so forth. So one of the things we're talking about is that, how do these practices reshape institutions? And like Professor Somin said, away from, for example, their supposed mission around public safety. If you're spending a lot of resources and time, ticketing people and so forth, what are you not focusing on? But also how they shape, democratic accountability to the public at large, but also to the communities that are most impacted by these practices.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to direct this question to Attorney General Ellison as a question specifically for you in relation to the topic of this book. Attorney General's office has been very strong on consumer protection. Can your office show some creativity and use your consumer protection tools and powers to protect incarcerated individuals from price gouging, especially on the basic necessities from food to toiletries to mail?
Of course we can. Let me just tell you, one of the limitations of my office is that we are complaint-driven. We are complaint-driven. We have about 28 people who will take your call right down if you call and complain, but we don't audit institutions to see if they're being fair to people. And one of the things about the criminal justice system is there's a certain amount of stigma associated with being associated with it. So we don't get a lot of complaints. Like why am I paying $20 for a tube of toothpaste from the commissary? That sounds like price gouging to me. But so that's why we go to prisons and we talk to people about consumer protection. But I would say that if you are concerned about our community that is confined, you should have them call 651-296-3353 and complain to the AG about unfairness that they are experiencing. And ditto for bail bonds industry. because we do regulate those products, and they are products, they are consumer products, and we absolutely should be doing it, and we can do it, but we really don't sua sponte, right? Just go and say, what do you guys doing in there? So we need the community to help us with this. So.
Yeah, Joe.
Thank you for those comments. I just want to add to that, you know, one of the, in our chapter sort of on political resistance and struggle and the conflicts over what's going on, one of the things that we talk about is there have been some very interesting sort of consumer law-based interventions, particularly in the bail area, around the idea that these are violating consumer rights, the contracts that people are pushed into signing in bail bond agencies. And so there's a lot of opportunity here for lots of creative actions. And I'll just say about our sort of analysis of political opposition, that one of the things to reinforce what the Attorney General just said is that we wind up sort of surveying all of these victories that have happened, which are amazing given the odds against them politically, and we wind up concluding that it really sort of comes from this sort of coming together, this conjunction of lots of different strategies. And you really need the outside activism, the protests, you really need the sort of innovative, creative legal strategies. You need to get people in office who are going to respond because they feel like the communities that they depend on to stay in office are up in arms, and not people who could care less about what those people in those communities are up in arms about. So there's room for lots of different strategies, and I think it's absolutely great to be thinking in these ways that it matters whether we call in and demand this kind of action. It matters that we come up with creative new ways to do that, and there are many points of entry, and they all matter ultimately.
And I would just add, you know, the bipartisan, or it's not bipartisan, across the spectrum nature of some of these struggles. Cato Institute, some of these, you know, more libertarian organizations have teamed up with ACLU and other organizations around civil asset forfeiture, around ending the revoking of licenses for fines and fees and so forth. And so that's been part of the story, is here as you get these cross-political orientation alliances that have actually been really effective in some of the areas that we're talking about here.
Can I just add, you know, when I used to be in Congress for 12 years, and I had a couple of bills that might surprise you. One of them was a bill with Rand Paul on repealing mandatory minimum sentences, which I didn't like because I thought, well, look, you know, sentence them how you think you should sentence them, but what does the Congress know about what should happen to this defendant, this time, this place, this location? The judge knows something, the probation knows something, the prosecutor knows something, and the defense attorney knows something. But what does Congress know about what this particular defendant should be facing? And then the other one was another Republican member on the issue of asset forfeiture, because there were some abusive cases, and we teamed up. And then when I was in the state legislature, Representative Eric Lippman, who some of y'all may know, he and I had a bill because we saw that all the states around Minnesota had dramatically higher drug sentences, dramatically lower drug sentences than Minnesota. Minnesota was sort of an outlier. Everybody had lower sentences than us. So we introduced a bill to just make them the same as the rest of the Midwest. And he wanted to put the money in tax cuts. I wanted to put it in drug treatment. But I said, hey, we can split it. You know what I mean? This is a chance to do something together. But there is, where I don't know about right now, but up until recently, there was a growing bipartisan consensus around these issues.
Just one small thought on this. I agree it's ridiculous if somebody in a prison commissary has to pay $20 for toothpaste, or if a phone call costs a ridiculous amount and the like. But I would caution against price controls as the tool for addressing this, because sort of standard Econ 101 says when you impose a price control, you get shortages, reductions in quality and the like. I study housing. When you try to address housing shortages through rent control, that's what you get. I would suggest that instead, both with housing and in these areas, the better option is to have more competition and choice. So for example, prison inmates like the rest of us should be able to order online to get various goods. I sometimes find that the prices on Amazon are lower than those at the supermarket, including for certain basic goods. So you can get, things like toilet paper, for example, cheaper that way. And I remember the days of when I was poor enough that I still care about that, even though, I'm lucky to be wealthy enough now that maybe it doesn't matter as much for me, but it certainly does matter for people who are incarcerated and others who are significantly poorer than law professors are. And it seems like that would be, the better way to get costs down. If some firm has been given a monopoly over selling to people in prison, that's a problem. And, instead, we can allow people who are incarcerated to take advantage of some of the many options for, getting lower priced, better quality goods that we have in our society, whether online or by other mechanisms. And that's Econ 101 suggests that's a better approach than trying to impose, price controls.
I'm sorry.
Sounds like Joe needs to
I
provide
just
some
want to say,
context here.
one thing here. So I really love and appreciate this comment from Professor Somin, and in this way. First of all, Econ 101 applies to markets. We don't really have a market in the prison. We have a monopoly contract in which the government has taken its control of human beings in an incarcerated space and turned that into an asset and traded that in exchange for a monopoly contract for a provider to come in and charge what it will, possibly a negotiated price with government, and to generate profits from that and then pay commissions back to government on that basis. So we're not really dealing with a market that would be regulated in this way. But I think that the point that I really appreciate Professor Somin making is there's lots of ways to respond to this. Part of the problem is that you have a captive market, that people can't have other options. So you could pursue, one avenue would be, hey, let's pursue access to providers online, stuff coming into the prison. I suspect some agencies running prisons might have objections to unregulated products coming in that way, but you could do that in principle. What that doesn't touch is the question of who should be paying this price in the first place. You're saying, well, we're going to accept the idea that people who are incarcerated are consumers, and rather than citizens who have rights and should be provided for. I mean, this comes down to a fundamental question, right? Is the cost of criminal justice central to what it means to having a democratic and just society, that we fund collectively, publicly, the price of having laws, having the rule of law, and addressing injustices and violations of law as a society? Or are we going to take the most policed and punished communities and push those costs away from the taxpayer, relieving them of that burden, and perhaps they're concerned with the issue because it now costs them less, right? And forcing that on to the communities that are most policed and punished. That's a fundamental question here, and I really appreciate Professor Somin raising it for us in some ways by talking about, should we just expand the market of choices available to people who are incarcerated?
So I want to make sure that the audience voices are heard, even though we might not have time to answer them. So I'm just going to quickly give you 2 or 3 more really pivotal questions, and then the panelists can pick and choose in 2 minutes what they want to answer. One question. How do you address the issue that says that privatization simply fills a void? Another question, are we able to identify the architects, the deep structure of these policies, the intentions and ultimate goals? Who are the key players? Another question, can we rethink the financial extraction of the disadvantaged without rethinking white-collar crime? And finally, how can we change the financial model? And is it possible with today's current political environment?
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. I mean, I don't think you're really answer much in the way seriously. But there is this idea, well, just the first one about filling voids, right? And it goes back to what I was saying before to some extent. But a lot of these things we talk about fill needs, right? Like people in prison, a lot of people in prison want to work because they are desperate. And even for, what we think are really, unacceptable wages. People enjoy and want the tablets, right? People need to get bailed out on jail. So a lot of things we're talking about are actually addressing needs. The question becomes on what terms are these needs being addressed? And how are people being positioned? And this returns to our sort of analytic concept of predation, is that it's really about the positioning of people in these sort of more disadvantaged subordinate positions that allows for private companies to charge exploitative prices for them, for government to charge exploitative prices to take advantage of their desperation. Right? That's really what we're getting at, is how people are positioned in a way through incarceration, through disadvantage and so forth, that makes them ripe targets for it. And so it's fully, for us, it is consistent for people to be grateful for a lot of the things that we talk about, grateful to be able to call someone on the outside, grateful for somebody to be able to use a tablet, grateful to get out of bail, and still, for us, it be a relationship of exploitation and so forth. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'll just say, on this issue of what about the political environment? One thing I've learned about the political environment, and it occurred to me that for the last 20 years, I've been asking people to vote for me, right? Mm-hmm. And that has certain pragmatic effects and channels your perspective on things sometimes. And I would say that the political environment depends entirely on whether there's some folks who will offer some leadership in the community to refocus our political attention. So, as I said, I was authoring bills with Republicans before I left Congress in 2018. Personally, I think that the current political leadership in our country exacerbates this problem. And I could go into that because it kind of kicks the door wide open for corruption and money taking and rent seeking and all that kind of stuff. But I do believe that the political will does exist in our communities, right, left, center, libertarian. I think it's there, but we just need some people who are willing to demand it, which is why I want to thank Professor Uggins back there. Thank you, because of his research, and this is a good reason why. Don't ever say that, oh, pragmatic practitioners are where it's at, not the academics. That's not true, because a lot of us who worked on felons voting got ideas directly from people like Chris and Joe and Joshua. So thank you for your work. And I think that creating a constituency for change is really important part of moving the ball here. Because in Minnesota, if you're under probation or parole, but you're out, you can vote, and those are going to be the folks and their family who are going to say, "Hey, this ain't right," And I'm not naive enough to believe it's a panacea. It's not, but it is a start, and it can spark a conversation which can work. Maine and Vermont never take your right to vote away. If you had people who, why do we connect voting and criminal justice that way? Well, we all know there's a long history behind it. But like today, what's the good reason for it? I can't think of one. And so I think that if we really allow more people who are incarcerated, perhaps justly, as I said, I'm not an abolitionist in that area, but I do think it's important that we are not hearing from people because they can't vote anyway, so who cares? But so I think that is another area. If you really want to demonetize criminal justice and squeeze out that exploitation, one of the ways to do it is to lift the voices of the people that most affected.
I think that's a great place to end the conversation. Thank you.
I was hoping.
Oh,
you don't want to close this out?
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, I'll say one more thing.
Thanks for that, Attorney General.
I just want to say something, maybe this is a good place to end. Someone asked a question about goals and intentions. Was this all intended or is it somehow an accident? This is a really common and very important question. And sometimes we get caught up in this idea, did somebody set out to do this or was it an accident? In some sense, but I like to think of it a little more like this. We ask sort of, or we talk about the idea of, is this by design? We can mean different things, right? And the first level is sort of, is it how the program works or is it a bug? Like, is this malfunctioning that's happening or is the design working as it should and generating this outcome consistently? And it's the latter, right? It really is generating, this is the design, right? And then we can ask a second level in which we say, well, do people know this is happening? Is there awareness to some degree? And are people continuing to do it, even though we know this outcome is happening, right? And I would say that that's where we're at, right? And of course, the third level is, did someone at the beginning set out to put together this whole regime? We don't argue that they did. We think people were intentionally creating this thing and that thing, and they began to knit together, and it all came together. But my point is that third level doesn't really matter. Because where we're at is the second level. We know this is happening. Part of what we document in this book is how widespread it is, how intensive it is, how unjust it is, how contrary to many values that we believe we should hold it is. And so the point we're at now is, who cares whether someone initially set out to create this regime? This is the regime we have. And the question is, it's our responsibility now to not contest it, is in a sense to accept it by design, right? And so the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Attorney General Ellison, Professor Somin, Page, and Soss for a great conversation. Those of you in the room who found this topic interesting, would like to know more, copies of Joe and Josh's book, Legal Plunder, will be available for sale as you're leaving. Before you go, the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance would like to let you know about events coming up in the next couple of weeks, and they'll post that. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see you all.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, absolutely.